First of all, let me say congratulations to Gregg Popovich and Tim Duncan and Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili and Kawhi Leonard and the rest of the San Antonio Spurs for winning the 2014 NBA Finals and doing it in the dominant, impressive fashion in which they did. Whether you thought the Heat were going to win this series or the Spurs were going to win this series, I think most people, and understandably so, based off of what transpired last year, assumed and expected this was going to be a very hard fought 6, if not 7 game series. And if anything, if anybody would have sat there and maybe said that a team was going to be likely to dominate in this series, it might have been the Miami Heat because they were 2-time defending champions. The Spurs were too old. They had nobody to match up with LeBron James. It was the exact opposite. But the ultimate thing for us to figure out is why the Spurs won the NBA Finals. And I think there's a lot of reasons that they ultimately came out on top in the strong, dominant fashion that they did. I think first and foremost, you have to point to the lost opportunity of last year. The Spurs had a 3-2 series lead. They were leading late in Game 6 in Miami, and really, for all intents and purposes, pissed it right down their legs. And I think the Spurs had a renewed focus and sense of urgency, knowing that they came this close, but ultimately let that great golden opportunity slip away last year, that they were very hungry and very motivated to make sure that they didn't do the exact same thing again this year. I think you also have to applaud Gregg Popovich's system of resting his players, knowing that he has, by and large, an older team, especially with his top guys, and that he should trust in his system and trust in the organization and trust in the depth and talent on the roster overall to be able to find rest for guys like Duncan and Parker and Ginobili throughout the regular season at different times. So that way, come postseason time, they are fresh and they are ready to go. And I think Popovich deserves a lot of credit for that. He's something that he's taken a lot of heat for the past couple of years, but clearly it paid off big time this year in the playoffs, and in particular, in my opinion, in the NBA Finals. I think you also have to look too at the San Antonio Spurs kind of organizational identity and the way that they construct and build their team. For a team that has been so good for so many years, they're still able to find key guys and find key role players over the years in particular. Their ability to find those foreign born players that can come in, not be the highest drafted guy, and come in and develop in their system, become big time players. You look like the Tony Parkers and the Manu Ginobilis. More recently, even though he played here in college, you could look at Patty Mills and kind of talk about it that way. Guys that weren't the highest, most highly thought of, the guys that weren't the most highly drafted, that end up coming in and contributing in big ways and fitting what the Spurs want to do as a team, as a basketball organization. You really have to applaud them in the way they have structured this organization and the way they've been able to replenish themselves over the years and keep themselves in the position that they have through astute signings and free agency, finding some scrap heap guys, finding these other foreign players. A Tiago Splitter would be another clear-cut example of that. The Spurs have done a phenomenal job of doing so over the years. You look at their organization, and this really plays out to their advantage, as it did throughout this series, as their superior depth. I mean, when you look at the San Antonio Spurs and the Miami Heat, you might sit there and say that LeBron's better than anybody that the Spurs have, and that Miami's big three is better than San Antonio's big three. But San Antonio could go 9 or 10 players deep, and the Heat, for all intents and purposes, in this series had 5 players. That was LeBron, Wade, Bosh, Rashard Lewis, Ray Allen. That was it. No real tangible contributions from anybody else whatsoever, in particular on the offensive end of the floor. And that superior depth, in order for the Miami Heat to win, the big three, the LeBrons, Wades, and Bosches, were going to have to be so far superior to Duncan, Parker, Ginobili, that it just, I don't think, as the series went along, became all that realistic to expect the Heat to win. They just didn't have the firepower that the San Antonio Spurs did. If it's not working for the Heat, this lineup or this configuration, it's not like they have a whole lot of options, a whole lot of shaking up they could do. They just got to keep rolling with it. The Spurs can do all types of different lineups, all types of different setups. They can do a bunch of different things that their superior depth allows them to do that the Miami Heat just didn't have the luxury to do. You could really look, too, to me, at what has been a major bugaboo of these Heat teams of the past 4 years, their lack of an identity in the low post, their lack of low post players. Whereas the San Antonio Spurs had something at least a little bit down low, and guys like Duncan and then Tiago Splitter. What did the Miami Heat have? Chris Anderson was a nothing in this series. Udonis Haslem barely played in this series. The only thing Greg Oden did in this series was sit in a suit and look like an older version of LeBron James on the sidelines. They had absolutely nothing down low. Chris Bosh, perimeter player now, not a post player. That really hurt the Heat in this series, in particular, in my opinion, because the San Antonio Spurs were able to control and dictate the tempo of the series all throughout, and the Heat didn't possess the necessary low post game, and in particular the post players, to be able to slow it down and make it more of a half court game and slow the games down into this high 70s, low to mid 80s, a more Eastern Conference style. The Heat were playing at the Spurs pace and at the Spurs mercy all series long, in part because of that lack of low post help. You look at the decline of the game of Dwyane Wade, not LeBron James, but Dwyane Wade. You could see the passion there. You could see the aggressiveness still there. It's just Dwyane Wade's not as good as he was a few years ago. He's starting to decline. Flash is declining rapidly into more of a flicker, if anything else, not a flash. And, again, when I talk about the superior depth of the San Antonio Spurs being able to go 9 or 10 deep and being able to do it comfortably, and the Heat could barely go 5 deep. Anything after that, they were getting absolutely nothing. Well, if a player like Dwyane Wade that you've counted on for so much over the past couple of years is clearly in a decline, that puts so much pressure on the other 4 guys, other old role players like Rashard Lewis and in particular Ray Allen, that leaves pretty much Chris Bosh and, primarily LeBron James to have to pick up all that slack. And it's just not a good formula for success. You look at the change in Chris Bosh's game. He went from being a low post threat and a low post presence to somehow deciding that it was a good idea to become a three-point shooter and the perimeter player. Ding dong, dumb dick. That's not helping anybody. And it sure as hell did not help the Miami Heat in this series to see Chris Bosh become a skinny velociraptor-looking version of an old Sam Perkins just sitting there jacking up a bunch of bullshit threes. This whole change in Chris Bosh's game where the Heat needed him to be a low post guy. They needed him to be that guy that could help set the tempo for the Heat in their favor for an Eastern Conference type of half-court style. He's sitting out there trying to handle the ball on the perimeter and shooting bullshit jump shots. And it just didn't work, and it didn't help the Heat and played right into the hands of the San Antonio Spurs. You also, to me, have to, yes, when you are the star player, you call yourself King James, you get all the endorsements, you get all the national media kissing your ass all the time. When it's great, but when it's not great, you have to take accountability and responsibility for it too. And LeBron's failure, to me, to properly understand his role as a leader and to understand what his team needed, when, how, and why, I think was a contributing factor for the series ending in 5 games as opposed to 6 or 7. Look, you could come up with all the excuses you want about this and that and everything else, but LeBron could still control ultimately what LeBron did. And LeBron far too often in this series was far too passive when his team needed him to be aggressive. You could sit there and talk about, he put up all these numbers. What do those numbers really mean? They don't mean a damn thing because they didn't come at the right time. He showed a lack of basketball IQ and intelligence, in my opinion, by not understanding what his team needed out of him and when. Like he talked about before Game 5, I'll be the leader, follow me. And he comes out and he's so aggressive and he puts up 17 in the first quarter. He's imposing his will. I'm like, yes, this is a LeBron that needs to put up 50 tonight, 45 tonight for his team to have a chance. And then he disappears basically the next 2.5 quarters and has the most unimpactful 31 points you could ever perhaps have in an NBA Finals game. And this was an elimination game. He just disappeared. Far too often, he was far too passive. Far too often, he was far too unselfish. There comes a point in time when you are the HNIC of all that you see in both within your own basketball team, in that final series, and in the league as a whole, you have to assert your alpha maledomness, and you have to sit there and take charge. If your team doesn't foul, your team doesn't foul. And look at Game 5. You look at the first quarter. LeBron was aggressive. He took the lead. His team fouled him. They elevated their level of play. When LeBron was passive, they fouled him, and it led to the team ultimately caving in and quitting. Fact. Period. And if you watch this series and you didn't see that, I wonder just how blinded you have been by the pro-LeBron media propaganda over the past several years. The Spurs had a huge matchup advantage with Boris Diaw on the offensive end. You're talking about a guy who they were lining up at the 4 and in some lineups the 5, and he was out there on the perimeter becoming one of their premier, dribble drivers and creators off the dribble for himself and others in particular. And the Heat just couldn't match up. What are you going to do? Put Chris Anderson on him? Are you going to do Chris Bosh on him? Chris Bosh can't stay with Boris Diaw from a lateral standpoint. And if you got to the point where you're putting LeBron James on a Boris Diaw, then good night, your series is done. You also look at Kawhi Leonard. And to me, a lot of people are going to talk about Kawhi Leonard's defense and how much of an impact he had on LeBron James. No, LeBron James took LeBron James out of the fucking game. But what Kawhi Leonard did on the offensive end in games 3, 4, and 5 was he truly made LeBron have to play hard on both ends of the floor. Whereas games 1 and 2, LeBron could sit there and relax a little bit because Leonard didn't do a whole lot, so James could help out on defense more. He could sag off when he needed to. Couldn't do that the last 3 games of the series. When Kawhi Leonard was in attack mode, they didn't have anybody else that could defend him, meaning LeBron had to defend him, which meant LeBron had to work a lot harder than you might have wanted or intended to consistently on the defensive end of the floor, which I think in part impacted his offensive game. So all the people talk about Kawhi Leonard and his Scottie Pippen type of impact from a defensive end, to me, again, clearly didn't watch the series because Kawhi Leonard's impact in the last 3 games on the offensive end is what was really making a huge difference because it forced LeBron to play both ends really hard, and as his defense became more and more important and he had to put more energy there, his offense suffered as a result, and his aggressiveness on the offensive end in particular suffered as a result. You look at the San Antonio Spurs, and you also have to credit them for their superior ability to create opportunities for themselves and others off of dribble drive penetration. I thought this was early on in the series what was going to be the key for the San Antonio Spurs winning it. For all the old school coaches and defensive-minded people that thought defense of the Spurs was going to be, or defense of the Heat was going to win this series, bullshit. Sometimes offense wins, and offense clearly won this series for the San Antonio Spurs, and it was their ability at times to have 3, 4, if not 5 guys on the floor that could all create a shot for themselves or others off of the dribble drive penetration that the Heat just could not defend, just could not counter. That truly was, if not anything, the ultimate X factor of this series. And when you factor in the San Antonio Spurs having so much superior three-point shooting to what the Miami Heat have. Chris Bosh is not a three-point shooter, even though he thinks he is. Dwyane Wade's never been a great three-point shooter. Guys like LeBron, he's so-so, sometimes good, sometimes not so good as the three-point shooter. Your top 2 three-point shooters are guys like Rashard Lewis and Ray Allen, and that's best coming in bits and spurts. You talk about the Spurs, who had a lot of more guys that could consistently cause damage beyond the three-point line, stretching out the Heat's defense, making them even more vulnerable to the dribble drive penetration. It was all of these things. And I think also, too, we have to look at the fact that the Eastern Conference being as weak as it was, and the fact that the Miami Heat, after making it to the finals through the 3 previous years, being 2-time defending NBA champions, then coming into this season, they really didn't have any major challengers in the Eastern Conference. It just didn't really materialize. The Heat, frankly, had a very easy path to the playoffs, and even Indiana, the team that a lot of people, myself included, thought might actually make the NBA Finals this year, or at least give the Heat a real, credible challenge and test, were nowhere to be found. They were surprisingly disappointing. So the Heat, I think, frankly, coasted to the NBA Finals, and when they got there, they weren't prepared and battle-ready and battle-tested like the San Antonio Spurs were, having to sit there and play in the Western Conference all year long, and in particular in the playoffs. It wasn't an easy path for the Spurs to get to the NBA Finals, so once they got there, they felt prepared and ready to go, where the Miami Heat were able to kind of relax and coast a little bit, and if anything, it did them a disservice. So there's a lot of reasons for the San Antonio Spurs, in my opinion, winning the 2013-2014 NBA championship, winning this year's NBA Finals in the dominant fashion that they did. They were just flat out the better coach team. They were just flat out the better team in terms of depth and superiority. They had all the key matchup advantages. And that's pretty much it. It's kind of bad, and I feel kind of guilty in a small way, the fact that I focus so much on the Heat and talking about LeBron, but I feel like all of these things do need to be addressed, that sometimes the San Antonio Spurs, in typical San Antonio fashion, just kind of go under the radar and don't get the credit and the attention for just how great of an organization and team they have been over the years. This is now 5 NBA championships in the past 15 years. They are a dynasty, even though it's been very spread out, and Tim Duncan has a legacy that takes a backseat to very few, let's put it that way. And Gregg Popovich himself has a legacy as a head coach that takes a backseat to very few. So again, congratulations to the San Antonio Spurs. It'll be interesting to see What happens to the Miami Heat going forward? I'll talk about that in the video coming up soon. My next video, I think, about the NBA on this channel is going to be about, can the San Antonio Spurs repeat as NBA champions next year?